everyone, welcome to Accessibility, Design Systems, and You with me, Josh Goldberg. Everything in this presentation is going to be on my website at joshuakgoldberg.com. That includes slide notes, alt text or images, attributions where applicable. I'll note that there are several animated images that in the presentation I enter and exit, but in the slide view, you might want to use the PowerPoint viewer's pause image to pause them. The agenda for today is going to be a few things. To start off, what is accessibility? Why do you want it? How do you do it? Why is it important? Once we've established that accessibility is important, what is accessibility? As in, how do you do it? What are a few examples of things that are inaccessible? After that, we'll pivot a little bit to talk about a design system. What is a design system? How does it relate to accessibility? How can you make one for your website? Once we've established what those things are, we'll then wrap up with some knowledge sharing and with some quality enforcement tips. How do you make sure people know about your design system and being accessible? And how do we make sure that things stay accessible and with the design system? To start off, A plus accessibility plus length plus Y equals accessibility, or ally. Accessibility is making your site work for people with various usage scenarios. That can be folks with, say, limited or no hand control, limited or low vision, a computer monitor that's smaller than you thought possible. All sorts of different various usage scenarios must be accounted for. Now you might be asking, can you give me some examples? Yes, I can. To start, reduced vision, someone who has very low eyesight, or maybe just like a bad pair of glasses or bad computer glare. For them, you might need to use reasonable color contrasts and big enough text to read. For someone who has really bad vision or no vision, say someone who is blind or legally blind, you'll want to use proper HTML markup with proper HTML semantics to make sure that screen readers, which are pieces of technology that can read the contents of a web page or other application to the user, make sure that those things can narrate properly what's on the page. If someone doesn't have a hand, or is on a laptop with a poor trackpad, or is just a power user and doesn't want to use the mouse, make sure that the interactive elements on the page, the buttons, the text inputs and such, can be tabbed to without a mouse and triggered with a keyboard. Important stuff. And you might still be asking, but why? Why do we need to do all this? Why make our websites good for all these special cases? Why is accessibility important? Well, to start, there's a moral reason. And for me, this is the most important one. Literally millions of internet users have some sort of disability they didn't choose. No one chooses to, say, be blind or have a muscle illness that stops them from being able to use their hands. Accessibility enables people with cognition, motor, vision, etc. impairments to use your sites. I don't have the worldwide numbers, but I know that there is over 8 million Americans with some sort of vision issue in 2010 who are using the internet, which means just extrapolating out for America, Europe, Africa, other continents, there are tens or even hundreds of millions of people with some sort of disability, impairment, alternate usage scenario that you want to make available on your website. If that doesn't do it for you, there's the quality issue. There's a concept of a curb cut, which is a little cut to a sidewalk that makes it easier for wheelchairs to use, but also just easier for people in general. Electronic curb cuts are things that make it easier to use the website for folks with accessibility needs that also happen to make it easier for the website to be used by everyone. Accessibility improvements are electronic curb cuts. They benefit everyone from casual users to power users. SEO, or search engine optimization, is when your website gets better results on Google. Well, that's helped by accessibility. A lot of the same techniques for SEO also help accessibility. If someone has poor screen visibility, maybe they're using a laptop out on the beach, well then color contrast is real good for them. Power users tend to love just tabbing through and not using a mouse. So if the moral argument didn't do it for you, hopefully at least the quality one does. If you're purely business and money scenario focused, well then there are business reasons to be accessible. Many organizations require minimum levels of accessibility in the partners and services they purchase. At Codecademy, the place where I currently work, we have had a lot of deals where we needed to be accessible so that someone can purchase us. So if you want more sales, be accessible. Lastly, if none of that does it for you, there are real legal ramifications, negative ones, to not being accessible. and there are positive legal ramifications to being accessible. A lot of countries, area zones have legal requirements that if you're a publicly available website, you must be accessible. In my favorite lawsuit of all time, the Domino's Pizza Company lost a lawsuit at the US Supreme Court level. The Supreme Court declined to hear the case out because their website horribly violated the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, and someone who was blind couldn't order a pizza, which is incredibly annoying. And I'm glad that they lost. So what are you waiting for? You just be accessible. Do it. It's important. It's good for the users. It's good for you. Everyone should be accessible. So let's talk about a few common accessibility mistakes and how to solve them. I'll do a quick cursory overview here, as I believe there have been other presentations that have gone over in detail. To start, the most common one, which you might have already seen in this conference, color contrast ratios. On the left, we have a medium blue over a light gray background. And if you squint and look at the screen, it's really hard to tell what that area says, the README. Now that violates the minimum color contrast requirement for someone with limited vision or poor screen visibility to read it. Therefore, on the right, we have better color contrast, a lighter background with darker text. Or if it's a light and dark scenario, it would be flipped, where we want to have more contrast in the text versus the background. If you squint, you can still kind of read the thing on the right. Another example is focus states. When someone is tabbing through the website, it would be real annoying if they can't tell which element is currently focused. This is true for both people who need to use it and people who choose to use it, power users. On the left, there is a slightly different focus state on the button. A lot of websites just remove the focus states, which is quite terrible. But it's pretty hard to see. It's half of a pixel more thick in my PowerPoint settings, which is approximately 0 if you look at it and can't tell. On the right, we have a much better focus state. There's a thick outline and a second outline, which is a lot closer to what browsers show by default. So if someone's tabbing through, they can tell, oh, I'm on the trigger me button. Good. Image alt text. On the left, we have an image, and without reading the right text, you would have no idea what this ABC123 image is. This is bad for SEO because Google doesn't know what to list the image as, and it's bad for accessibility because a screen reader can't narrate out what's on the image. And even if someone can see the image, they still might want the screen reader to tell them what it is because they might have poor image visibility or a cognitive defect that makes it quite difficult to read images. So add alt text saying what the image is. In this case, we happen to know without even seeing the image that the image is a smiling man in a suit, comma, levitating. Good for us. Lastly, interactive element types. If there's one takeaway you should take from this talk, if you're a front-end developer, it's that you don't put on-click listeners on non-interactive elements 99.9% of the time. A div is not a button. A div is the generic, there's no semantic meaning to this element. So on the left, if you have a div on click equals to some action, the browser doesn't know that that's a button, or maybe it is, maybe it isn't. We can't tell looking at this HTML. So the browser isn't going to force the screen to be able to focus on that div, meaning someone tabbing through your website wouldn't be able to interact with this div. If this is, say, the submit form in a payment form, then that div not being able to be used by someone who doesn't have a mouse is pretty bad. Therefore, use a button if it's interactive in this way, or some similar interactive element, where a button does have semantic meaning saying it can be interacted with and clicked with, so you'll want to on-click on a button instead of a div. So in general, please use semantic HTML. There's a reason why people put so much effort into the HTML spec, making things like buttons, inputs, H1 through 6, and not just div for everything. Okay, we've talked a little bit about accessibility. I'd like to pivot slightly for a bit and talk about a design system. We'll talk about what it is and how does it fit into accessibility. So what's a design system? At its core, a design system is a collection of shared visuals and/or components that are used across at least one of your applications. At the very granular level, you might have the fundamental building blocks, the proto-molecules, the atoms, the animations, the colors, the spacings. Here we might have, say, a half dozen colors ranging from blue light to some grays. You might have spacing levels between them. Then building up from atoms to molecules and so on using an analogy, we might have text components like headings and paragraph text or buttons. Building on top of those, you might have forms, for example, or large groups of elements. And these are important because they let you share and reuse code across your website. For example, on the Codecademy Learner dashboard today, side note, I have 18% learned TypeScript, very excited about that. You can see usage of quite a lot of our design system on this page. Props to the team that made it. To start off, there is the color situation, where we see 7 different colors on this web page, and they're repeated quite a lot. The gold is in a few places, off to the right, maybe a little bit in the progress bar. The beige is the background and all over the place. The white, gray, and black are used. On top of that, we have a few design system pieces of text, like the header text, heading text, the body text. We have a lot of different atoms, they're called, little interactive or shareable elements like the edit buttons, which are text buttons, or the fill button. We have some iconography. We've got the logos. We have these little side unusual components like the progress bar and the hex character. So all this stuff is part of the design system. And they're shared and reused across many web pages, which makes it so that we have a beautiful, consistent visual. Looking at some bigger components, we have the global header and these little list sections that are repeated a couple of times, showing that a design system doesn't just have to be the little things, it can also be big layouts that you repeat. And the key takeaway with design systems is that no one wants to redo work over and over again. Designers are always coming up with beautiful new designs, which is great, but we don't want to have to recreate a 9001th button to get them to work. So if you have any sort of accessibility work, front-end work that you've done, sanctioned colors, buttons, and other inputs, some fancy complex elements like the little toggle buttons that have accessibility implications, put them into the design system. Put them in the design system. Now, just a real quick note, a lot of design systems start as just a folder of common components in a bigger project. In React, there's that infamous source/components folder that people put 1,000,001 elements in. That's fine, as long as there's some unified source for your components. If you have multiple projects, if you start with a monolith and end up splitting out, it's common to split out your components of the design system into a separate repository that's published as an npm package. And once you do that, you can do things the way we do at Codecademy, which is have a design system, which say you might call Gamut the way we do, and then little React components that you can export from that design system and use on your page. So this looks like just any other React library you might use. There are other design systems you can find online, like Material, that work similarly. But the beautiful thing here is that these elements are sanctioned. They're known to be workable. They're known to be accessible. The fill button is known to have the proper roles and ARIA meetings and focus states and all this. So you don't have to duplicate work. No one wants to duplicate work. So this is good. Now that you have a design system, let's fast forward a little bit. Let's talk about how you can make sure that the team knows about it, that it's well documented, and people are continuing to use it. To start, documentation. Write your docs pages and keep them updated. These are just an assortment of questions people have asked me in my role. Where are components? How do you develop against it? When can we customize them? What about bugs? What if a screen reader isn't narrating properly for some edge case? What if I don't like that color? I would definitely recommend having a dedicated FAQs section wherever your documentation is for people to continuously add to over time. Having a well-documented design system is key to that design system's adoption. If people don't know about the thing, they're not going to use it. And if they don't know how to use it well, they're not going to use it well. Which brings up to Storybook, which is a great way that I highly recommend to document your design system. It allows you to write descriptions in a format such as MDX, which I really like. It's a mix of Markdown and React that creates interactive documentation pages from your components. It also has really good integrations with tools like TypeScript and other friends that help make your docs pages nice and informative. Just as a quick example, gamut.codecademy.com, which I'll go to right now, gamut.codecademy.com, has some Well, to start, it has some performance issues, which I hear the Storybook team is working on. But this is an entire website that's mostly auto-generated from a few text-based documentation pages. Oof, this performance thing has gotten worse over time. There we go. Haha. And if you want to say inspect the button element, we can go to the button page, see an example of the thing in real usage, and then see all the allowed props for that button element, whether it's disabled, what the on click is, whether it has a different variant. Cool. What does the danger variant look like? That's new. Oh, guess it's not implemented yet. Oh, well, and then we have different, say, variants of buttons. And then one of the key features of Storybook that I really love is that typically you'll have a show code option on the page where you can see the, say, React code that went into creating your element that you're seeing on the screen. So awesome. Using these documentation pages, someone can take a look at whatever documentation thing they need, let's say a button, and learn immediately what does it look like and how do I use it to make it look like that. Awesome stuff. Another thing that I love to talk about is presentations. Giving technical and non-technical talks to your team regularly on the design system and associated usage is key. They're a great forcing function to make sure that you keep the knowledge updated and the documentation ready and visible. Documentation pages do tends to decay in quality and relevancy over time. Presentations, little chalk talks, brown bags, whatever your team calls them, also provide encouragement for asking questions and getting people pumped and excited about the thing. There's nothing quite like the developer team, pardon me, excitement over seeing a new thing demoed by one of their team members. And then finally, pairings on a more granular level. Spend quality time with your fellow developers and talk to them individually. A presentation is good for getting knowledge distributed at the high level. This is the thing. This is generally why you want the thing. But there's nothing quite like pairing with someone one-on-one or small group to really show them the details of the matter. So let's say that you have a new button or new component in your design system and you want to move over to it. You could do all the work on your own, or you can bring someone new to share in the knowledge. You can show them how to clean things up, show them how the design system works. As a key statement, I like to say, if you develop in isolation, the knowledge of the thing will be isolated. So bring people in, work with them, pair with them. It's a good time. Lastly, quality enforcement. How do you make sure that once you created that design system, it's used well and stays good? 10 out of 10, highly recommend TypeScript, which as you saw earlier, I am at least 18% successful in learning. Restrict your consumers to only doing what's accessible using TypeScript. Let's take a look at this submit button component. You don't need to know React to understand this too well. The gist here is that it takes in a color prop or T and then renders a button where the background color is that color. And without TypeScript, in just vanilla JavaScript, we have no real good way of restricting what that color can be or knowing what it should be. Someone might render a submit with the color dark blue or with the color light blue, and there's nothing in code to tell us whether those are okay. We could add in a bunch of runtime checks if color is not in the sets, throw an error, but that's a pain in the butt and then adds bloat to our packaging. What TypeScript gives us is a way of describing what is allowed and what is not allowed in our components. Again, don't need to know TypeScript or React to read this code snippet. The gist here is that we have declared that this submit button takes in one property, one prop of type color, pardon me, name color, which is of type either dark blue or black. So if someone passes in the background color dark blue, that's fine. But if they pass in light blue, which is not on that list, then TypeScript will tell them, no, you can't do that, which is great. Now we can make sure that people aren't passing in invalid background colors for our buttons and thus violating color contrast. Yay, accessibility. Drake is happy with us. Second, use Axe or an equivalent tool. Axe is a tool that can make your build fail on detected accessibility issues. It looks at your page and complains when there's something wrong. Now, I will note, in my experience, Axe really only finds up to a little less than a third of real accessibility issues. But reducing your workload of things you need to find later on by 30% is pretty great. And Axe can tell you whether someone's actually tried to make a page accessible in the first place. So a couple of code snippets, which you don't have to look at or memorize too closely, is that at the unit testing level, Axe does have a few good integrations, such as just Axe. And you can unit test an individual component to make sure it doesn't have any detectable HTML accessibility violations. So that's nice. At the end-to-end testing levels, such as with the wonderful tool Cypress, you can make sure that your code passes the whole page of automated accessibility tests. And in fact, let's go back to Chrome a little bit for a couple of demos. On Storybook, there is a really cool tool called the accessibility integration, which lets you run an accessibility test on your component. And here we see that my component, my button, has no violations in 7 passes. We have the right ARIA attributes, which are the accessibility attributes in HTML. We have unique IDs, all this great stuff. And even better, if you go to a website, subtle plug from mine, hello, there's even a great Axe DevTools extension that you can get for browsers that lets you run Axe on a website. I'm going to check my own website. Yay, still no violations. Would have been real embarrassing if I'd introduced one just before this talk. And if you don't want to download a separate extension, the Chrome and Chromium Lighthouse tools also have accessibility that they can scan for. Again, I really hope I didn't introduce any accessibility issues recently. That would be embarrassing. Yay, good for me. Cool. So highly recommend. Lastly, get feedback from real users. Unless you know accessibility, you really don't know accessibility, so you'll want to get an expert. There's a lot of stuff in accessibility that is not super duper obvious to people who aren't trained in it or don't use it regularly. When we converted Codecademy.com over a couple of years to being accessible, there are all sorts of wild and wacky rules that make a lot of sense, but we didn't know about. For example, keeping IDs unique on a page and also having IDs with the proper ARIA semantics, using the proper ARIA labels, live narration, when an element changes, should the screen reader narrate whether it changes, all sorts of color issues that we had. It was hard. Fun fact, animated images or animations in general that are longer than 5 seconds should be possible because that's distracting. Who would have thought? So that's all. Let's recap all the things I talked about today. What is accessibility? It's making your site usable for people with different usage scenarios. A design system helps you be accessible. Knowledge sharing, how do we make sure that people know about things? Pro tip, Storybook. And quality enforcement, using things like TypeScript and Axe to make sure that people don't mess up and to make sure that things are accessible. Thank you very much for listening to me. I'm joshuakgoldberg.com and on Twitter and on GitHub. And my website is joshuakgoldberg.com. You can find the slides here. Lastly, I'd like to thank the conference organizers, CSSCAMP and such, for holding this conference despite everything being remote. I really appreciate it, and thank you for having me. Cheers.